Everyone, welcome to the OSBI webinar series, Powerless to Powerful. We're here to talk about school change for powerful results. It's Washington State research describing leadership behaviors to support a culture for learning for both adults and students. My name is Suzann Girtz.
And I'm Salina.
We're also the authors of Powerless to Powerful, the book series that tells the story of change in Washington schools. So this segment is the overview, which gives you an advanced look of what's coming up. So we'll start with the big picture and talk about the research and where it came from. Then in part one, we look at the conceptual framework, which we call the what.
And then in part two, we'll take a look at the action framework, better known as the how behind our work. And finally, part three, we'll put it all together into to deepen the understanding of each of the different parts.
So here we go. This overview section provides information on where the research came from, and it primarily focuses on the why of the work ahead. So something that I think is noteworthy about this research is that it came from Washington's own schools. We chose outlier school districts that have been identified because they decreased disproportionality while they were increasing graduation rates. So this model was begun at a turnaround school, but then we had two whole cohorts of large and small districts from which to visit, do interviews, talk to students, staff, and administrators, do surveys, look at artifacts, compare external reports. So these case studies then led to a thematic analysis where we tried to find a common language to capture the essence of the most impactful practices in the simplest language. So in a time when I keep seeing schools turn to business models for insights on change, we're proud to instead provide educational research, and not only educational research, but research in our own backyard, Washington schools, to guide our efforts. So in the pursuit of equity, we looked at increasing achievement while decreasing disproportionality, and that was the why, or the purpose, of most of the schools we got to work with.
As we studied these schools, we noticed that there was something different about the culture. We called this a culture for learning. And what we found in these schools as we looked at it is three big ideas, which we boiled down to what we call connect, build, and envision. That is, in a culture for learning, adults and students were connected to the school where they understood how they fit into the well-being of the organization. This provided a sense of self-worth for adults and students alike. Also, powerful relationships were being built. Adults and students at all levels supported each other in achieving individual and group goals. There was a real sense of belonging to the well-being of the school. And finally, there was a sense of hopefulness because adults and students were able to envision their future, where they had a clear understanding of what was next as they created change in the schoolhouse. There was a positive outlook for what their future holds, and this sense of hopefulness led to a sense of a culture for learning.
So one way to think about how we decide where to put our efforts in school change is informed by Marzano's research. This table, I think, is sometimes misinterpreted as we all need to be the most effective school and the most effective teacher. But of course, that's only one. There's only one most effective school, right? Most of us are more towards the average and working towards most effective. And of course, there are other people that have not yet even reached average. So this table sometimes implies a fix the teacher kind of mentality of fixing schools, but we reject that. I don't think that's the way to read this table. Chuck has not interpreted this table this way. There's a different way to look at it. Instead, take a look at the least effective school and the most effective teacher. That raises achievement to the 63rd percentile after 2 years. Of course, not too many years later, a most effective or high performer will leave a school that doesn't have building level supports. However, with average teachers and an effective school, you can see even greater positive impacts to the 78th percentile. And the most effective schools then support teachers in their growth, which leads to greater achievement. So why have we embraced this fix the teacher mentality when research shows it is less effective? That's what I love about this Washington State research. It's shown a productive way to shift to a culture for learning that works towards equity and success through doing our work in a very different way.
So building on what Suzann just mentioned, this notion of creating effective schools for change that supports teachers, it's important then leadership becomes more in tune to what behaviors that I'm doing that supports the core beliefs that send a consistent message to the staff. Often when we're working with groups of leaders and we ask them the questions, what would you like to do differently in your school to create positive change? Often they'll mention something around the line, I need my teachers to do more of this or that. And in reality, the question is, what will you be doing differently as a leader to create a culture for learning? And what we've found then as a result, that real change starts from the outside in, meaning it starts with schoolwide systems supporting teachers differently in a way that allows students to be successful. So therefore, for effective change to take place in a schoolhouse, we believe that leaders today need to demonstrate new behaviors to change old beliefs of those they serve to build a culture for learning grounded in trust. As Michael Jr. says, this work is grounded in the clarity of purpose, the why of our work. And when you know your why, your what has more impact. If you are working with a coach or team, we suggest that you watch the clip of Michael Jr. of Knowing Your Why.
So here's how we're going to move forward with this webinar. You just heard the overview, the big picture, and how we'd like you to engage with Washington State research and thinking a little differently about school change, which will lead to working differently about school change. Next comes part 1, and that's an introduction to the conceptual framework, which is the what. So we just talked about the why. Next comes the what, the basis for our work. And after that, part 2, we talk about the how, the action framework. And I understand people generally want to skip right to the how. Just tell me how to do it. But this takes a little more thoughtful process than that. So we're hoping you'll slow down and go through this parts 1, 2, and then finally 3, putting it all together, including the shifts in leadership beliefs and behaviors that promote the work. In addition to that, we'll have some supplementary resources available to you online at the OSPI website. So this is the end of the overview segment. Thanks for joining us and for your work in schools.
This leads us to part 1, the conceptual framework, or the what of school change. The conceptual framework builds on the why of the work to describe the what we do to build a culture for learning. It centers on 3 big ideas or concepts: academic press, supports, and relational trust. Academic press is grounded in the belief and the related expectations that parents, staff, and students are capable and are involved in doing the work. There are 3 big ideas around academic press when considering this notion of high expectations and belief. First, adults expect and believe that each student is capable of reaching high expectations. Students expect and believe that adults are there to help them in achieving high standards. And finally, adults believe in themselves and their colleagues.
So it's interesting to note we've got a long legacy of focusing on academic press and putting our chips here in our U.S. school change efforts. But research suggests that when academic press is the sole focus, test scores actually go down. So there's more to the work, but also a tangible power in the results of our beliefs about each other.
Support is grounded in systems that care for people, including students, parents, and staff, and their overall well-being. Support is developed when each of us perceives opportunities to connect to the school. You are known and cared for and nurtured, and teachers and students support and care about each other's success.
So it also involves an emotional connection, a form of caring as individual support, not just systemic supports. So it's also vital to note that these supports are necessary for the adults in the system as well.
So what is interesting to note is, as Suzann mentioned on the previous slide, if we only have academic press with no supports, test scores go down. If you have forms of support without academic press, then it tends to lead to some form of mediocrity. So each are equally important in creating a culture for learning. Relational trust is the glue that holds the conceptual framework together. There are three big ideas embedded in relational trust. First, the notion of feeling safe, but not necessarily comfortable, having something to offer each other, and putting in time to help. This is the foundational piece of creating a culture for learning.
So the way that looks when we investigate those three factors, people describe feeling safe when others knew their strengths and their interests and how they connected to the school's visions. And then they were encouraged to take risks, and it was safe to do so. And others, knowing their strengths, respected and drew on their expertise. Having something to offer can come in the form of offering valuable insights that help each other grow and intentionally supporting the work through resource alignment. Putting in time looks like being available, being present to discuss difficult issues, and committing energy to supporting the work.
Academic press, supports, and relational trust come together in the conceptual framework. But remember that the foundational piece is relational trust. Without it, efforts cannot be maximized. Notice that when academic press, social support, relational trust, when these three circles come together as one, then the culture for learning becomes maximized. Suzann and I have come up with an acronym with the word BEST. The B stands for believing and expecting that teachers can do the work. The S stands for supporting teachers intentionally, and T is for trusting relationships through fostering growth in others within a safe environment. When these factors all come together, success is developed for a culture for learning where both teachers and students can be successful.
This is the what of the work. Now it's actualized through the how, but the conceptual framework is something that everyone needs to understand and see their role in before you get to the action framework. That will come in the next part of the webinar. Thank you for joining us for this one, and we hope you'll access the supplementary resources and continue to learn more. Welcome to part 2 of the Powerless to Powerful web series. To get the most out of this, we hope that you've already watched the overview and part 1. So this part focuses on the action framework for school change. We call this the how of the work.
So as we researched each of the different outlying school districts that were doing exceptional work in terms of reducing the achievement gap, there were 5 distinct themes that came out of this research. 1, the notion of how data is used. 2nd, systems of support were in place. People were engaged in collaborative inquiry, and the byproduct of these things interacting was a culture for learning. It is also critical to remember that without the conceptual framework, the action framework is impossible to actualize.
You may remember from the conceptual framework that the more those themes interacted, the greater the culture for learning. Also, the conceptual framework could be overlaid right on top of this action framework, and you can see again the heart of it is increasing the culture for learning. So here we've taken a slice, the how, and shown you the 5 themes and how they are dynamic and interactive, or should be if your goal is to maximize the culture for learning. So there is a sense of coherency and intentionality in how they work together. And this image is intended to show you the nature of that relationship. It's developed with the use of data through the collaborative inquiry process that aligns to school-wide systems implementation. And then the leadership planning process is the connective foundation that aligns the work from each one of these themes. So as we go through the webinar, next we're going to independently discuss each theme, and then at the end share how when they're working in harmony, you really develop a culture for learning in a way that fosters student success. And the first one we're going to talk about is data.
So the working definition that we came up with to define data was analyzing and reporting evidence using an inquiry process to inform the work at all levels of the district in implementing change that aligns to the mission of helping each student in being successful. As we developed each theme in a working definition, we also found important factors that would support that theme. Regarding data, we found 3 major factors that supported the use of data.
So you saw the definition up top. You see the 3 factors that are below. And then in the supplementary resource, we have indicators. So you can actually take a look at your own setting to see through your lens how you're working in this theme. So the 3 factors that you would be looking at are how data is collected. Effective schools indicated that it was collected through thematic approaches and seen as a whole rather than isolated parts. Those schools also employed principles of action research. And the final factor was that key players at all levels analyze the data on a routine basis.
So what types of data is important to collect so that you're able to develop a culture of learning? There are 4 major types of data that we recommend collecting. 1, demographic; 2, perceptual; 3, contextual; and finally, achievement. What kinds of data should a school district be collecting to make wise decisions and develop a culture for learning? There are 4 basic types of data that are important to collect. That is demographic, perceptual, contextual, and achievement. Demographic data provides important details that allows schools to know and understand the nature of those they serve. Demographic data includes such things as ethnicity, gender, special population, and economic considerations. It is critical that you know the people that you are, know the people and understand the people you serve. So demographic is critical information to collect.
Perceptual data is gathering people's perceptions and thoughts around a given issue or a topic. And we found that in many instances, the most powerful form of perceptual data is gathered one-on-one. Perceptual data allows for clear understanding of what stakeholders are thinking and feeling.
The next form of data is contextual data. I think this form of data is most overlooked by most school leaders. Contextual data describes within your schools what kinds of systems do you have, what's your discipline data tell you, attendance, or social emotional needs that students may need. With understanding deeply how does our contextual data inform how we can serve those in our school district.
And 4th is achievement data. You may have heard of it. Schools have an abundance of achievement data. It's usually represented by high-stakes testing or other forms of summative assessments, but there are other ways to collect achievement data, of course. Common formative assessments, student failure rates, benchmark testing. And achievement data can put a spotlight on a problem, but it doesn't explain the why behind the lack of success and might even be misleading as a spotlight on a problem. Typically, achievement data is where a schoolhouse puts most of its time and energy, though. But if we use only achievement data, that creates a vacuum and some increased anxiety and stress for students and teachers that most likely results in test scores going down. Again, we mentioned earlier about putting all your chips in academic press and test scores going down. That's why you would not want this fourth column to be the place where you do all of your work. You need to keep score on what's important, and there's a lot more in these 4 categories than just the one.
So in employing the principles of action research, it's important that you utilize all forms of data to ensure you make wise decisions. As we look at behavioral attendance and the social, emotional, and achievement needs of students, then we know that certainly all forms of data become important to ensure student success. We call this the broken triangle. If any one side of the triangle is not going well for the student, the ability to be successful goes down considerably. So looking at each of these factors, one can see the importance of demographic data to ensure equity, contextual data to gain a deeper understanding of types of programs that are working or need to be developed, perceptual data to provide student and adult voice in the change process, and of course achievement data, because that is the bottom line for a school's mission, is helping each student graduate.
So it's important to make sense of different forms of data on a regular and ongoing basis. Therefore, it needs to be collected and analyzed so that you can take action to support teaching and learning in a timely manner. So in the schools that we studied, they showed continuous and ongoing focused data collection and interpretation. And so I'll just share some of their areas of inquiry. They ask questions such as, what is your current academic success rate? How many students or seniors are on track to graduate? How many students are operating below grade level in the core content areas? Which students are in crisis behaviorally and or emotionally? What does attendance data tell us? What supports are working and what's needed? So when it was used effectively, data allowed teams to analyze what was happening as it related to systems development, implementation, and success. We sometimes call this keeping score on what's important, so we ensure continuous improvement.
When effective schools were collecting this data, they typically then would do a thematic analysis to see where kids were at, where students were at in being successful. Here is an example of an achievement system, if you will, and numbers of credits toward graduation. And so that they could analyze the number by putting kids into different students, So after we collect the data, it's important to do a thematic analysis and create a visual representation of the work in a way that you can do something with the data. Here's an example of how one district used student progress toward graduation with number of credits that they gained and developed categories on where students were at in their journey. This process allowed them to be able to know very intentionally which students were in risk of graduating at that time. Note that you would do the same with behavioral data, attendance data, and social emotional data so that you can see a holistic approach of that student and his or her progress toward graduation. Regardless of types of data that it needs to be regardless of types of data being collected, it needs to be integrated and whole in helping to develop systems of support for those you serve.
I will admit this was my favorite part of the research in our multiple visits, talking to students and others. Data used correctly will be seen by both teachers and students as a form of caring, as it leads to supports that promote their success. And I'll share the stories with you when we see each other in person. But they truly perceived it as caring when there was action that followed. Key points when using the data included to use all the forms of data, use it to inform, not drive decisions, keep it simple, less is more, trust and believe in yourself, your teachers and your students. Don't overthink it, move to action, over-communicate to everyone involved, and search for meaning in what the data is saying, and then what will be done. So consider also that data assists in developing early warning systems through your data dashboard. It can help you put a spotlight on the right problem. And it creates an easily visible classification system to display the results and communicate. This leads to action versus just contemplation. When you harvest a variety of data points and sources, it's important not to become so overwhelming with more for more's sake, but also consider accessing student voice and providing them an entree into the systems of support. In that previous image where we saw color coding, I visited one school where every student knew their current status as a color, knew what the color meant, and knew what that meant they had to do next to improve. So a complete list of indicators then that support the work of effective strategies in data collection and application are in the supplementary resources.
As we return to the action framework, notice that there's an interaction between each one of the factors that we're describing. So data allows us to know who our students are and what their needs are. Now, what do we do with that data and how do we align it to systems? So this section will look at systems and how they focus on the behavioral management, achievement, and social emotional needs of students, supported by the K-12 guidance process. The important thing about systems, and since data and the data dashboards that we're talking about, this information is actually collected on a weekly basis. So it's grounded in real time and real needs. So systems then are spontaneous and work to the needs of the current reality of each child on a weekly basis. These systems are never done because our students are always changing. So it's also the very nature of systems development means it's also embedded in continuous improvement. As you collect contextual data, you start recognizing which systems are working on and which are not working. And then you can be more intentional with your resources so that professional development is guided and aimed on real-time needs, which adult learners then can apply that learning the very next day. And know that this is really important that we found in these effective schools, that accountability resides in formal leadership. Support teams and school-wide systems are the responsibility of those dedicated professionals, but in the end, it's the formal leadership that is accountable for the success and or failure of those systems.
So one metaphor that Chuck often makes, and he'll even show a video of a guy that's spinning plates, and he's just getting the first few going, working on the last few, and has to run back to the first ones to keep putting energy in them. It's exhausting, and that's oftentimes how we run our systems in our schools. They're activity laden rather than systems driven. So staff are busy. They're engaged in sometimes unrelated or parallel programs that result in feelings of being overwhelmed and putting out one fire after another, basically running from plate to plate. But a school that operates through integrated systems grounds its work in behavior, attendance, social, emotional, and achievement needs of students to provide some coherency and intentionality so that everyone aligns their efforts and supports each other. When they're aligned, rapid change takes place in the classroom because teachers start to see the collective whole working together to support their efforts.
What's interesting to note on schools that are program and activity driven is often a new flavor of the month comes out. And that's why some of those circles you see are a little bit bigger. Oh, we need to try this idea or this program or this activity. But nothing ever comes off the plate, so to speak. And so not only as we add new spinning circles, we actually increase the number of activities that we're guided in. And as Suzann indicated, leads to burnout and frustration. We mentioned earlier to you that without the what, it's impossible to do the how. What's intended by this slide is to recognize that without the conceptual framework, that is social support, academic press, and relational trust, it's nearly impossible to actualize the system changes that need to occur around behavior, social, emotional, and academic needs of schools and students.
So school-wide change begins with that system alignment, and living through that conceptual framework. It's a dynamic process, and it ignites a willingness for groups and individuals to re-engage with the school because they see the collective whole working together to support their efforts. So it's dynamic and almost simultaneous. However, building leadership must declare and act first in the process of developing a school-wide change.
And know that, we will have in our resource materials examples of different forms of school-wide systems at every level of the schoolhouse.
Returning to the action framework, the third theme we discovered from the outlier school districts was collaborative inquiry, which we sometimes abbreviate COIN, because that's a long word to keep rewriting every time.
So when we look at it, sometimes people, collaborative inquiry, or COIN, our working definition is engage in collaborative action research to improve teaching and learning through the inquiry process. And we found three major factors to talk about. Collaborative inquiry, we define engage in a collaborative action research to improve teaching and learning through the inquiry process. We found three major factors that supported the COIN process. One, grounded in principles of action research. Second, and from our lens, we believe maybe the most important factor is driven by the roles and responsibilities of the specified group doing the work. Quite often we define collaborative inquiry and the work teachers have to do, and back to what Suzann was talking earlier about Marzano's work. Well, what does collaborative inquiry look at the school-wide level and as well as at the leadership level? What is that? What does that look like? And we'll talk more about that. And finally, how, based on this process, how are resources then aligned and provided?
So for purposes of this webinar, instead of focusing at all the different levels, which Chuck mentioned very much changes the look of COIN, we're going to focus on two levels, and that's leadership and school-wide systems. So the leadership COIN team is focused on developing a school-wide plan that engages the right people in systems work. And that planning process will be discussed later when we review the last theme of the action framework. The second level of COIN engages school-wide support services. So this is the team that analyzes forms of data and aligns them to school-wide systems. So this team's actively monitoring and supporting students and teachers in achieving desired results through a holistic approach. But to be prepared for your school-wide COIN team, it's critical that the leadership team has clarified their thinking and built a data dashboard at the existing levels to show the different supports and systems that might jumpstart and inform the process.
So looking at school-wide systems and school-wide collaborative inquiry, who should be involved? I suspect in your building you have one or more of these kinds of supports already in your schoolhouse, whether it be a social worker, a school psychologist, behavior interventionist, specialists, attendance officer, learning coaches, and of course counselors. So who should be involved and how do you get them involved in doing this work? I want to take you back for just a minute by thinking about this broken triangle and think about behavior attendance data, social emotional data, and achievement data. Which one of these are collecting which forms of data as it relates to that triangle? So as you reflect on the types of data being collected and who collects what as it relates to the success triangle, then that's when you start bringing these teams of people together where they meet on a weekly basis of what is it their early warning or their data dashboard is telling them, and how do they use that data so they can have a holistic view of what that student looks like. And then how do I take that information and link students to different kinds of systems of support that already exist or you are in developing your school. And of course, once you start tracking student success as it relates to the types of systems that they're in need of, You need to follow up, communicate with those being impacted, and of course, keep score on their success.
So leadership plays a crucial role in ensuring that the school-wide supports are developed and used intentionally through their planning process. So we name that the 45-day plan, which we'll talk about later. The place to start doing that might look different whether you're at the elementary or secondary level. We found that the place to start linking data and caseloads at the middle and secondary level is to put the spotlight on academic press, which will lead the way with social, emotional, and behavioral needs, as well as attendance. But at the elementary level, if you look carefully at attendance and behavioral or social emotional data, that typically leads the way to academic needs.
I'm going to go back to the previous slide. Now that you're collecting this data and you have different people involved in that data, how do you decide on the roles and responsibilities for school-wide support help? You know, the standards for school counselors are focused on advocating for students and teachers through a collaborative process that utilizes data and promotes systemic change. The bottom line is, you know, there are just too many kids in need today, whether it be a social, emotional, behavioral, or academic needs, that we will never have enough counselors to meet those needs. But we believe that counselors can play an instrumental role in bringing different key people in the school together to meet weekly as it relates to their areas that they're collecting data on. And then as a team, the counselors facilitate and help link students to different systems of support where people are engaged in the work. And so this team identifies and tracks all students through this data dashboard. And then they provide ongoing discussions to ensure systems and accountability is happening and helping teachers and students be successful. And it's important in this process to establish caseloads on the need and expertise of the team. And we have a coined phrase, we call them every student having a guardian angel, to ensure that the services are being delivered in a way that supports the work and that systems are doing what it's intended to do to make sure that student is successful throughout. Formal leadership plays a critical role in this process by developing a user-friendly data dashboard that is simple and timely, aligning the systems grounded in the evidence and keeping score to inform what's next.
About other levels of coin work, like school-wide systems, but we know that that's happening simultaneously with grade and department level systems, and everyone's working diligently to meet the achievement needs of students. So that data is coming from the grade or department levels. And one model that describes that work is the CIA cycle, curriculum, instruction, and assessment. It occurs over a short period of time. The one we looked at was typically less than 3 weeks, focused on accelerating learning through clarity of learning targets, and then how these targets are assessed and aligned to systems of support so that students were getting real-time academic support when they needed it. And many schools have processes like this that are occurring through their collaborative work on a weekly basis.
The fifth theme, leadership, is the connection that aligns and maximizes the potential of all other themes. Leadership is the framework. In this framework, requires that we plan and take actions that re-engage the staff and students to their purposes, their whys. Organizations often use this term mission. So we call this leadership planning, or a 45-day plan that promotes autonomy with accountability for leaders so that they will take charge of the building that promotes school success.
So once again, you can see the definition and then the factors. Outlier districts routinely discuss the importance of leadership in planning and acting on the vision of the district. The planning process focused on the overall well-being of each student through systems of support and resource alignment. Also notable from the outlier districts, they looked at vertical efforts by the board, district office, and building level leadership to align to the belief that we own all our students and each of them can be successful. looking at a growth mindset that focused on the why of the work and efforts occurring from both the top down and bottom up, collaboration occurring at all levels, and leadership teams using data to continually monitor and change and inform their planning. There was a certain amount of deftness, like they didn't see something through simply because someone built it at some point in the history of their school. So if a program wasn't working, they weren't beholden to stick with it through the year if they had no evidence it was working and students were in need of some other support.
So in looking at leadership and the planning process, what was evident in the schools that we did our research on was leadership was not afraid to face its own problems. They recognized that with data would inform their thinking in a way that they could face their current reality, but also look at systemic change through collaboration that provided a sense of hopefulness. And know this kind of willingness to engage in the planning process promoted the key ingredient, relational trust, to those they serve. You know, this notion of systemic goals is important to understand and how that applies to meeting the needs of the whole child, and sometimes how that work plays out not only within the school, but with local and school and community resources. Suzann and I did a complete webinar on OSPI defining the 45-day planning process and the notion of systemic goals or system goals in relationship to the change process. What we realize in focusing on systemic, or as we refer to as timeless goals, then one isn't engaged. It brings the school improvement planning process alive and immediate over a short period of time that support teachers and students in their success. And you can find that support on the OSPI webpage.
So this is the end of part 2, the action framework segment. We hope you've got that image burned in your mind right next to the conceptual framework. Next, we'll talk about putting it all together. Thank you for joining us and for your work in schools.
Welcome to the final webinar series. And we return now to the action framework. And as you know, the heart and soul of the entire model is about establishing a culture for learning, not just student learning, but adult learning, parent learning as well. So when we look at a culture for learning, there was, again, in interviewing the schools, some big ideas or themes that came out right away. Again, trust is present at all levels of the organization. Each person will fulfill his or her responsibilities. This notion of feeling safe, having something to offer, and putting the time was evident in a lot of what each of the different stakeholders mentioned as we interviewed them. They also know those they serve. They know the why behind the work, the importance of equity. Embracing all their students. They all belong here. That means each student is ours, and we want to hold on to them and ensure that each one is successful where they have a voice. And again, this notion that leadership is accountable and staff is responsible for ultimate success. This led to our working definition for culture for learning, establishing an environment that demonstrates a clear belief that through a collaborative process and systemic supports, each student and staff will be successful in doing the work.
When the conceptual framework and the action framework are working in harmony, and leaders provide systems that support teachers, students, and parents, then everyone involved will re-engage in the work with a clarity of purpose that allows the mission of the school to be actualized. And as a result, everyone connects to the school, builds powerful relationships, and envisions their futures.
So when we examine our beliefs and try new behaviors that support teaching and learning, we build trust. And trust is the bottom line to engage in the work. When that occurs, leadership teams act on their 45-day plans. School-wide teams monitor and connect teachers and students to supports. Teachers act on their collaborative inquiry goals in their learning communities. Students engage in different processes defined by the systems, and parents regain hope because of the specific actions of the school. This is the end of part 3, putting it all together. We hope you will access. I'm sorry. This is the end of part 3, putting it all together.